Hello everyone, my name is Wesley de Boever. I'm working for Tesken and I'm currently presenting from our demo lab in Ghent in Belgium. At Tesken we produce micro CT devices like this Tesken Unitom XL you see here in the back, and of course we use them for the well-known application of producing high quality 3D datasets to look at the structure on the inside of all types of materials. Think about batteries, car parts, 3D printed parts and so on. At Tesken, we also focus a lot on 4D experiments, so we can visualize dynamic processes as they happen in real time and in 3D. Since we add the dimension of time, we call them 4D datasets. And in the presentation I will show you today, I will talk about the many challenges that exist in the analysis of 4D datasets and how we can tackle them by using software programs such as Geodict in collaborations with our colleagues at Math2Market.
Now, the analysis of a 4D dataset can be actually seen as an analysis of a series of 3D datasets. So analysis of a 4D dataset with n time points is n times an analysis of a single 3D dataset. That allows the evaluation of global parameters over time, such as porosity, size, volume, and density. In one of our most famous videos, which you can see here, the analysis of a beer foam, this is illustrated. So by scanning a beer foam in a dynamic way, we can follow a parameter such as the porosity of that beer foam over time. So here you can see that by analyzing each individual volume, we can calculate the volume of the porosity and visualize that in a graph over the entire duration of the experiment. However, when we look at these different time points, there is no link between the time steps. So it's impossible to track changes in morphology of an individual pore. If you look at the two pores that are highlighted in the circles here, one is yellow, another one is red. They are actually the exact same pore, but since the labeling starts from scratch in each time step, there's no link between these time steps. So we had a communication with the Geodict software engineers, and they made some 4D analysis script that enables tracking of features over time. And I will show that by using two examples. The first example is a study on the dynamics of opaque flow. So it's a proof of concept study that we did together with the University of Berkeley in California. And it was used to study the influence of coatings on opaque surfaces. The real goal was to have particle tracking inside of a micro CT device. When we look at the experimental setup, we of course have our X-ray source and detector, and in there we place an opaque pipe. In this case, it was actually a carbon fiber tube with flow inlet, a flow outlet, and we let seeding particles, which were silver-coated glass spheres, flow through that pipe, and we visualize that by using micro CT. If we look at the experimental setup, here you see my colleague Jan putting it in the scanner. Basically, what we have is a syringe pump that was connected through a slip ring. So the pump is on top of the slip ring, which allows endless rotation of the tube. And on top, we have an opaque carbon tube that contained our liquid, glycerol in this case, with the seeding particles that were pumped through it. The results you can see here. So we did visualize the particles as they moved up inside the tube at 6 seconds temporal resolution. That means we did hundreds of full 3D CT scans, and each of those scans only took 3 seconds. So took 6 seconds. So we can actually visualize the flow of the particles here. You also see some black spots moving up and down in the tube. So basically, these are air bubbles that go a bit faster than the particles. You can also still see some artifacts in the experimental setup. Some particles are moving down since the flow regime was not completely under control, but this was okay for us as a proof of principle. So we imported the data sets in Geodict. The raw data was filtered by, if I'm not mistaken, a non-local means filter, and that allowed for the segmentation of all the particles. Then these particles were analyzed, after the segmentation, these particles are segmented, and for each time step, the position of the particles was tracked, and by linking the time steps together, by actually making sure that particles were labeled correctly, the flow paths of all the particles could be reconstructed. And this is what you can see here in the animation. In red, you see the spheres, and in black, you see the flow paths of the particles during the experiment. Now, this is nice. This is a visualization. We can follow the particles. Very good. But then the goal was, of course, to have some numerical data out of it. And this was also possible in GeoDict. So what you see here, again, are the particles segmented as they're flowing. I think this time it was in a scan with 3 seconds temporal resolution, so even much faster. And from that, there can be velocity plots extracted. You can see this on the right, and you can see that there's negative velocity plots, which means the particles are going up, and the positive velocity plots, which are actually the ones that we don't want for the particles that could go there. But again, proof of principle that we can track particles at a very high temporal resolution using this experimental setup.
In the second example, I talk about metal foams. Metal foams, such as this aluminum foam here, are used in lots of applications. Mostly they are used for either lightweighting stuff, so making something lighter without making it lose strength, or in the application where you need buffer zones or crumple zones. Think about cars that need a crumple zone to protect whoever is in it. So in this experiment, we used a sample like this, which is a 2 by 2 centimeter cube of such an aluminium foam, and we placed it inside a compression stage inside the scanner. And in this experiment, we wanted to compare the experiment, so really in an experiment compressing a real sample, and we wanted to compare that with modeling of the same experiment in GeoDict. We performed this experiment in 2 phases. So first, we did a compression experiment on a sample like this. After the compression, we took the data and used that to train or give valuable input parameters into our numerical compression model. After that, we took a new scan of a sample, an initial stage, and we modeled the compression on that sample. And afterwards, we did the experiment again on that second sample to see if the experiment matched the real data. So the results I'll show you now.
So what you can see here on the left side is a segmented CT scan of the animation that was in the previous slide. In order to do the modeling, we did have to crop the data a little bit, so we don't work on the full data, but we have a cuboid sample of about 8 millimeters wide and 12 millimeters high. On the right side, you can see that in GeoDict, it is possible to segment the cells, the pores inside the foam, and by labeling them, we could actually look at the complete cells, the complete pores individually. You see in this segmentation, we only have 5 individual pores. The other pores were actually not complete. The cells were cut by the bounding box of the analysis. Now, what's really nice about the exact same approach that we did before, we don't lose the information of an individual cell, an individual pore. As we do the compression, and on the left side, you see the compression data of the experiment. On the right side, you see the stress strain curve that we got from the compression stage. We can match those data and look at the deformation of each individual pore. And you see the behavior is completely different. The green pore almost does not change in shape. The lighter green pore at the bottom and the blue pore at the top, they have much more deformation. So we look at individual cells in this larger structure. Now, the next step was to perform simulation, to perform modeling of our experiment. So for that, we used the software, we used the FFT-based voxel solver FieldMath in GeoDict, and you can actually see the result already at the bottom. In white, we have the data from the experiment, so that's the real live compression of the metal foam. In red, you can see the compression in the simulation of GeoDict. already at first glance, you see a pretty good correlation between the two, I would say. Now, like I said before, this was the initial run, and we used that to calculate or to get our parameters for a best fit of the model. So you can see the parameters that we used on the left there. The total compression was about 35% of the height, and we used symmetric boundaries with no stress at the tangential boundaries. If you compare the stress-strain curves of the simulation in red with those of the experiment, you can again see a very good match between both datasets. There's only a slight deviation at the complete beginning of the experiment, and we believe this has a lot to do with sample preparation. So surfaces that are not completely flat when they are fit inside the compression stage will settle a little bit in the beginning, which means there's a deviation in the initial compression of the experiment. But all in all, we have a very good agreement between simulation and experiment. These initial very satisfying results, we went to a second experiment. And like I said before, now we changed the order. We started with a static CT scan of an aluminium foam sample and did a numerical simulation based on that. Same voxel solver, same parameters, same compression range, and same boundary conditions. So we took also a sample from the same batch of materials, the same batch of aluminium foam, to ensure that at least the material properties were the same. You can see here in red the stress-strain curve and the visualization of the compression as results of the modeling, and at first sight, of course, these results look good. On the other hand, we don't really know, so we need to prove that also here the simulation was correct. So we did an experiment, and here we did again the same compression inside our Debond compression stage in the micro CT scanner, and you see now in gray that we added the data from the real experiment. If you compare the gray stress-strain curve here again with the red one, again you see a very good match, and also the visualization of the compression. White is the experiment, red is the simulation, is again a very good match between both examples. And of course, although the simulation was the main goal of this experiment, but again here we could do the same as we did before, segment the data set, analyze the porosity, analyze the cells, and look at individual deformation and match that with the stress-strain curve that we observed during experiments. Again here, in this case, we actually got a little bit more pores, about 10 or 12 complete cells in our volume. So probably the cell size here in this area of the sample was a bit smaller. Feature I want to address in both the experiment and the model is the concept of buckling. If we look at the data here, and this is the experimental data on the left side, we see that the compression of the metal foam is not happening in a uniform way. We see that at certain locations, the struts do not just bend, but they buckle in a very particular way. So it's in a few snaps where everything is moving. We actually see the same happening in the modeling, in the numerical data. At first even, it was believed that this was an artifact, but we could prove by the experiment that this is really happening with these structures. So even those things are captured by the model. Again here, this is the same view. If we look in a little bit more detail, you see the buckling of the struts in a very similar way in the experiment on the left or in the numerical simulated data on the right. So that was everything I had to show for you. In conclusion, so by taking object information across different time steps, GeoDict can be used to follow local parameters across long 4D experiments. So we can follow the parameters on individual objects. Particle tracking and reconstruction of the flow paths, velocity paths is possible in GeoDict, and by combining experimental data with the finite element models in GeoDict, that allows us to validate both validate the models, but also to improve the input parameters of these models. Finally, I would like to to say many thanks to the Math to Market team that helped us for all their support, for all their efforts. And if there are questions, I'm here to answer them. Thank you very much and see you next time.